Mic isn't on. Okay. Good evening, everybody. I'm in a remote location this evening. It looks a little bit like I'm in a sort of high class terrorist video. You know, like the ones where they just before they suicide bomb somewhere. I'm not going to do anything like that in the name of the hybrid origin theory. But I am in I'm not in my studio, so I decided to take a bit of a break and do this remotely. So if you could see me, if you could see what I'm wearing a Hawaiian shirt and a pair of khaki shorts, but 100% cotton, and I've got my linen jacket and wide brimmed hat out there. I'm not in another country though. Blink twice if there's a gun to your head. So I have got a copy of the book with me anyway. It's my travel copy. It's a smaller version. What about doing an Irish pikey call out? What I could do like a Richard Dawkins call out or a Chris Stringer call out video where I call out Chris Stringer at the Natural History Museum. So I call him out for being you're fucking out of Africa, fucking shill or something. Anyway. We're going to carry on with chapter 5, which is aspects of Western psychology. We was getting quite close to the end of it. Let me just turn myself down a bit in my headphones, not to you. How's that? NA Theory in the chat. And Ralph Hexham. Who else we got? The Only Way Out is in. Michael Carley. Good. Okay, so I think I'm going to read through the last bit that I've done last week, and then we can sort of carry on into it, because otherwise it's going to sort of sound a bit disjointed. Okay, so this is chapter 5, Aspects of Western Psychology, from Total Man. Can we doubt that Joey had secretly, and this was about Joey the mechanical boy, which was the little boy who had pipes and tubes that he carried around with him because he thought he was a robot. Can we doubt that Joey had secretly always thought of the world as potentially a sea of excrement into which he would be sucked down were it not for his machines, i.e. his ego in projected and artificially enlarged form? Can one fail to suspect that all these psychotic patients see the emotional and autonomic side of their personalities as in some way totally devouring, overwhelming, or destructive? As Joey's true ego strength grew with protracted therapy, the controls and defences could be gradually dismantled and the risk could be undergone of the world's becoming, or being, a mire of excrement. It may well be that all babies have experiences of the world similar to those described by adult psychotics. But in the normal course of events, that is, with the implicit and explicit support of the mother and other adults who are patently not swallowed up or destroyed or driven away by the child's fantasies, but are reassuringly unharmed by them, these experiences may not be terrifying. They may in some way even be pleasurable. Cf. the thrill of terror. It may be that only when the working through and experiencing of the fantasies and accompanying sensations is delayed beyond the appropriate time, that the prospect of them becomes, paradoxically, increasingly more terrifying to the developing ego, precisely, perhaps, because of its increased sense of reality. In some psychotics, the life-saving, actually life-destroying, initial stratagem of denial has been only too successful. The feeling side of the personality is almost completely beyond the reach of the ego. This is frequently perceived by the patient, who may be desperately aware that some precious part of life, that is, real life, is being or has been lost, perhaps forever. There is, finally, the spy in the enemy camp situation, where the psychotic consciously or deliberately takes on the aspect or character of what he most fears, a step that somehow prevents the final annihilation. It is illustrated here by David, an 18-year-old schizophrenic. Like so many of the others, he had always been a very good child who did everything he was told and never caused any trouble. Until the death of his mother, he had simply been whatever his mother had wanted him to be. But then and this is a quote, but then he found he could not stop playing the part of a woman. He caught himself compulsively walking like a woman, talking like a woman, even seeing and thinking as a woman might see and think. For, he said, he found that he was driven to dress up and act in his present manner as the only way to arrest the womanish part that threatened to engulf not only his actions, but even his own self, or ego, as well, and to rob him of his much cherished control and mastery of his being. That's from Lang. This was essentially the theme of Hitchcock's film Psycho. Joey also, in another sense, is an example of this type of response. Machines were better and harder than people and ran things. Therefore, the best course of action was to become a machine. Very much like now. A more general instance that, it can't be emphasized enough what this is all leading to. This is really about artificial intelligence and the way people are responding to the state of the world at the moment is that they wish, the only way out is in, says it, transhumanism. That they wish to be machines because machines don't break down. So if you're not on drugs, if you're not on SSRIs, then you want to aim to be a machine. Okay, a more general instance of the behaviour being discussed, however, is found in the speech of schizophrenics. So typical is the evolved language or word salad of these individuals that it is sometimes termed schizophrenies and regarded as a diagnostic symptom of the illness. As the examples show, it is unquestionably associative in character. Julie, in her Psychosis, called herself Mrs. Taylor. What does this mean? It means... Oh, is this a quote? Hold on. Yeah, this is from Bruno Bettelheim. Julie, in her Psychosis, called herself Mrs. Taylor. What does this mean? It means I'm tailor-made. I'm a tailored maid. I was made, fed, clothed, and tailored. She was born under a black sun. She's the Occidental sun. She was an Occidental son, i.e. an accidental son, whom her mother, out of hate, had turned into a girl. That's from Lang, actually, it's a quote from Lang. And this is Bettelheim. Nor could he, Joey, name his anxieties except through neologisms or word contaminations. For a long time he spoke about master paintings and master painting room, i.e. masturbating and masturbating room. It is as if the patient has decided, or at least is able, to take over the process of association that is normally unconscious. What one sees here is essentially a creative process. It is not mindless, as it at first sight appears, but extremely mindful, frequently of so high a quality that one does not exaggerate the position to regard it as art. The general relationship of the unconscious to the creative process will be more fully discussed later. In other cases, however, one has the impression that the unconscious has somehow got into waking consciousness. It is not easy to think of a suitable analogy here. Perhaps something as bizarre as an army of octopus rising from the depths of the ocean to invade a tourist beach. So, another quote. I read newspapers because they gave me newspapers and things to read, but I couldn't read them because everything that I read had a large number of associations with it. I mean, I'd just read a headline, and the headline of this new item of news would have quite sort of very much wider associations in my mind. It seemed to start off everything I read, and everything that sort of caught my attention seemed to start off everything I read, and everything that caught my attention seemed to start off bang, 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 like that, with an enormous number of associations moving off into things, so that it became so difficult for me to deal with that I couldn't read. In discussing the origins and etiology of psychosis, Lang, Bettelheim and others are explicit in the view that the phenomena observed are either not explicable or are much less adequately explicable in psychoanalytic terms than in some other terms. And this is Bettelheim quote: "During his first year with us, Joey's most trying problem was toilet behaviour. This surprised us, for Joey's personality was not anal in the Freudian sense. His original personality damage had antedated the period of his toilet training." This is a Lang quote now. "An insensitive application of what is often supposed to be the classical psychoanalytic theory of hysteria to Mrs. R might attempt to show this woman as unconsciously libidinally bound to her father, with consequently unconscious guilt and unconscious need and or fear of punishment. However, the central or pivotal issue in this patient's life is not to be discovered in her unconscious. It is lying quite open for her to see, as well as for us, although this is not to say that there are not many things about herself that this patient does not realize. One proposes at this point that the term in which psychosis, as opposed to neurosis, is best accounted for are those of an ego psychology. In the extracts from Freud's writing, it was clear that the influence of the libido, the unconscious, on the personality required the existence and resistance of juxtaposed ego forces. Conversely, it seems equally clear from the multiple evidence of the present section that explanations of the actions of psychotics and schizophrenics require not simply an ego psychology in isolation, but the existence of a juxtaposed libido force if they are to make adequate sense. In the interest of maintaining the distinctions proposed, from here on we shall refer not so much to psychoanalysis, since this term in the hands of its proponents has a history of being able to account for the totality of human behaviour, but rather to libido analysis or libido psychology. There will be more to say of both psychosis and schizophrenia at another stage. For the moment, however, we turn to a brief consideration of the experimental position regarding mental abnormality to see what evidence, if any, is forthcoming to support the views of this last section in general, and in particular the proposed divisions into ego psychology and libido psychology. So that's good. We're starting to get a sort of a definition or a distinguishing line between Freud and so it's been parcelled off into a smaller section, which is good. That's where it should be. It's not a total. No one view is the total view of humanity. It's like everything has a portion of it. No one's got the right. No one's had the total answer. Whereas psychoanalysis regards neurosis and psychosis as having essentially the same origins, as being in most senses the same illness, so that schizophrenia is seen as a very bad case of neurosis, experimental psychology views these as essentially different. This latter view is that also of the present book, and appears, as we have seen, to have the additional support of at least some leading psychiatrists. The kind of pointer which the experimental psychologist looks to, and his methods, are described by H.J. Eysenck in several of his publications, the one directly concerned here being the dynamics of anxiety and hysteria. Eysenck reports a study in which a number of psychiatrists were asked to indicate in respect of a large number of patients those traits or symptoms from a long list of these which applied to each particular patient. Some of the items frequently indicated by the psychiatrist in respect of neurotic patients were lifelong or episodic anxiety, neurotic traits in childhood, unsatisfactory early life, lifelong or episodic hysterical symptoms, anxiousness, symptoms of over 12 months duration before admission, unsatisfactory adolescent adjustment, family history of neurosis, lifelong or episodic obsessional symptoms, low energy output, and bad work record. In respect of psychotics, frequently mentioned symptoms were delusions, hallucinations, ideas of reference, motor disturbances, mood disturbances, impairment of thought or memory, retardation, suicidal impulses, social withdrawal, suspiciousness, and family history of psychosis. One can broaden one's impression of these two groups of patients further by reversing the statement about the opposite group. If the neurotic child had an unsatisfactory early life, the pre-psychotic child presumably had a satisfactory early life. From the mother's point of view, at least as we have seen, this is true. From the theoretical side, experimental psychology sees the neuroses and psychoses as the outcome of bad, inadequate, or inappropriate learning, conditioning, during the early years of childhood. They are, as it were, agglomerations or hierarchies of bad habits. The experimental treatment of these two conditions is usually termed behaviour therapy. It involves the application of the principles drawn from conditioning experiments, first to undo or dismantle the faulty habits, and second to establish new, correct ones. The more precise details of the procedures involved do not concern us here. However, what is of extreme significance for our present argument is that classical procedures are used in the treatment of neurosis and operant procedures in the case of psychosis. As far as the writer is aware, while it has been frequently suggested that some sort of classical conditioning situation underlies neurosis, the proposal put forward in the previous section that some or perhaps all psychoses have a similar operant basis has not so far been made elsewhere. Yet does not the fact that it is operant methods which are successfully used in the behavioural treatment of psychosis, quite aside from any other consideration, urge this conclusion? One might argue further that operant responses established in the early years of life, like classical responses in the same period, are possibly unusually resistant to extinction. The generally greater plasticity of the young organism compared with the greater resistance to impressions and stimuli of the older organism is in any case a fairly well agreed fact of psychological life. Actual examples of the persistence of early operant conditioning may be seen in the imprinting of newly hatched ducklings on moving objects, a topic to be fully discussed in Chapter 11. As has been established experimentally, the amount of effort, that is, of physical movement, which the duckling expends in following the moving object, is the major variable in determining the strength of the resultant imprinting learning. A more everyday instance is seen in the persistence of regional and class accents in adults, often despite attempts to change or disguise the accent. Even where the cover-up is apparently successful, such a person almost invariably reverts to his original accent under conditions of stress. A comparison of the relative merits and demerits, and in particular the respective aims of behaviour therapy and psychoanalysis, would not be wholly relevant to the central argument in hand. It is suggested, however, that they be regarded as complementary rather than as alternatives. This text in no way seeks to deny that the mechanisms underlying the classical and operant processes are an important, even a major part of personality structure. In terms of evolution and development, they certainly predate the emergence of the higher personality functions. Probably the latter could not have evolved, and in fact did not evolve without them. And yet there is no justification for what one can only describe as the astonishing assumption made by experimental psychologists that a complete explanation of personality and the facts of psychological existence can be constructed in such terms. In concluding this chapter, several points may be emphasized. There are two basic mechanisms of human conditioning. This statement still holds even if one prefers the alternative minority view that they are two forms of one process. There are two broad groups of mental illnesses, neurosis and psychosis. This statement still holds, even if one prefers the less extreme view that there are two forms of one process, e.g. transference and non-transference neurosis. There are two non-experimental forms of treating these. One, psychoanalysis, which admits that it can do little, if anything, for psychotics. And two, what this text has termed ego analysis, the type of approach advocated by Lang, Bettelheim and others, who, in addition, explicitly reject the psychoanalytic interpretation of these conditions. There are two forms of behaviour or conditioning therapy. One based on classical conditioning and used with neurotics, the other based on operant procedures. Oh, I've got to just change the shot a minute and then turn the camera back on. Hold on. And we're back. There are two forms of behaviour or conditioning therapy. One based on classical conditioning and used with neurotics, the other based on operant procedures and used in respect of psychosis. This book has earlier postulated two major areas of personality on the basis, of course, of quite other evidence, which are referred to as System A and System B. Without wishing to open up any detailed discussion of these next points at this juncture, the argument begins to perceive, amongst other things, links between System A, psychosis and experimental psychology, and between System B, neurosis and psychoanalysis. Conceptually, all conditioning principles are a System A product. System A products are by nature reductionist and dissociative in character. The analytic view deals with effectively the same phenomena as does conditioning, but in System B terms. System B theories are always by nature holistic and associative in character. At this stage, no further explanation of this tentative position can be attempted. So, that's the end of chapter 5. So that's, I hope people who thought it might have been going down the sort of a Freudian apologist pathway can see now that it's really just separating these things out into the two camps, and that Freud obviously is working in one area, and Freud is also Jewish, and a lot of the Jewish stuff works in that same area. As we'll get to that later on. Let me just find my new intro slide. So just so I can mark the next chapter. So that was chapter 5, chapter 6. Okay. So. And we're back. So we're into chapter 6, which is in part 3, trance and anti-trance. And this is some socio-behavioural phenomena of Western society. I'm just going to have to just line up my slides, because we've got some slides coming up. Okay. A point has perhaps been reached where the ground has been sufficiently prepared for the central theory of this book to risk advancing to be recognised. From now on, the theory itself, rather than discussion about the need or the justification for the theory, takes the centre of the stage. Evidence will, naturally, continue to be offered. There appears to me to be no way whatsoever of avoiding the conclusion that the human personality, the personality of every member of our species, is essentially of a dual character. Not simply this. The two parts each have a very large measure of autonomy. They subserve quite different ends. They are indeed centred in two different universes. The first of these is the inner, existential universe of man. The second is that of the physical, material universe around us, which exists in our presence and our absence, both before we are born and after we are dead. This second universe is, certainly, governed by laws which we as human beings can come in a sense to understand and manipulate. But in its actual creation, we had no part whatsoever. Thirdly, and perhaps most importantly, the manifest attributes of the two divisions or systems of the personality are, in every conceivable sense and every single aspect, opposite and antithetical. One cannot stress too highly the central importance of this last statement, which will be justified. These two main systems of the personality we have termed System A and System B. We have spoken, respectively, also of the male principle and female principle. For principles, however, would be better served by two less sexually oriented expressions, which is not, however, to deny that the male and the female of the species have close respective links with these principles. In respect of System A, we can appropriate an existing term from Freud's psychoanalytic theory, the reality principle. For the second, a suitable term also already exists, but this is not widely known. In order to have a term of reference to hand until the other can be further defined, System B will be said to be governed by the alternative principle. Some further refinements to the tentative basis of personality outlined in earlier chapters are now in order. Previously, it was stated on numerous occasions that System B was female and System A male. Similarly, that the former was unconscious and the latter conscious. As generalizations, these statements continue to hold good. They are nevertheless incomplete. For part of maleness, System A is also unconscious, and part of System B is not female. In this connection, incidentally, it is worth recalling Freud's insistence on the separation of libido and ego instincts in the unconscious. The stylized form of the personality triangle shown in chapters 3 and 4 is this. Our slides. Okay. So we can see that A, the top half of the pyramid, waking consciousness, and then below the line we have the unconscious, which is B1 and B2. We know already many of the attributes of these sub-elements. Subsystem B2, derived from the sympathetic division of the autonomic nervous system, is concerned primarily with aggression and flight, with states of rage and states of fear. Subsystem B1, the parasympathetic division of the autonomic nervous system, is concerned with states of rest, of quiescence, of simple being, and importantly with sexual arousal. Women, one observes, are not generally noted for their aggression. They are, at least in men's eyes, noted for their sexuality. Interestingly, it's difficult, if not actually totally inappropriate, to refer to a woman as a coward. Certainly women experience fear, and certainly they sometimes run away. More usually they hide, perhaps because men are better runners, or submit in some way, but still they are not as a rule termed cowards, certainly not in the physical sense. No one really expects them to fight, or at any rate to fight and win. Men are expected to fight, and to refuse or to run away is cowardice. Thus, for these and many other reasons already discussed in previous chapters, subsystem B2 is more logically assigned to the male, while subsystem B1 may be more appropriately considered female. System A, on the other hand, remains essentially a male province. It is concerned primarily with 1. Volitional motor and muscular movement, and the male is clearly more muscular, and 2. With logical objective thought. Already, the implication behind the last statement will seem to cast a slur on the intellectual, that is, the logical ability of women. There are, unfortunately, worse slurs to come. Yet these line up very well with observed facts, as we will show. The next slide. The typical male and the typical female personality profiles are exhibited below in Figure 4. The use of capital letters indicates the dominance or preponderance of the subsystem concerned. Small letters indicate that the subsystem concerned is not dominant. Studying Figure 4, one may be tempted to make a quite unnecessarily value judgment and say that the male personality is better endowed than the female. It is preferable to say instead simply that the human male and female personalities are differently endowed, with particular strengths and weaknesses in opposed areas. In any case, it should be constantly borne in mind that all human beings, male and female, possess all of the attributes in question in some measure. Of course, women are capable of aggression and logical thinking. Of course, men can be gentle and considerate. The point one is making is that certain of these attributes tend to be typical of most men and others to be typical of most women. If a horizontal dividing line is inserted between the conscious and the unconscious, as in the two triangles of Figure 4, the acceptable result is produced that the female personality is predominantly unconscious, i.e. therein lies its major endowment, while the male personality is predominantly conscious. Regarding the use of capital and small letters in these models, it will be appreciated that this is a drastic oversimplification of the actual position for demonstration purposes. There are clearly many degrees of aggression possible between B2 and between capital B2 and lowercase b2, just as the precise level of logical thinking, capital A to lowercase a, will likewise differ from individual to individual. Moreover, to say this once again, it is of course clear that not every woman is a wholly typical or average woman, just as not every man is representative of the male norm. With this clearly understood, we can continue to handle the component parts of personality not unmeaningfully in these gross terms. Various permutations of the basic model are possible which also yield acceptable results, that is, which produce some reflection of what can be observed in everyday reality. If the figures now considered are, however, stereotypes rather than characters in the round, that is actually no weakness. More will be said of the nature and genesis of stereotypes in a later chapter. A certain type of dedicated or single-minded academic, the pedant or scholar, lacking in aggression but in no way considered feminine, could well have the first personality profile shown below in Figure 5. Let me just get onto Figure 5. There we go. The model here brings out too that the personality of this individual is basically a conscious, volitionally directed one. The unconscious or libidinal side of personality has relatively much less influence. The second profile of Figure 5 could variously be that of certain homosexuals, or of a certain type of artist or poet. Here the unconscious as a whole is rather stronger than the conscious, which, however, is not weak, and the unconscious itself is predominantly female. One needs to remind oneself when producing these models that this is not intended as a new parlour game or even an academic game having no relevance or real significance for actuality. It is true that one here generates what one might call a certain sense of astrology or fortune telling. This is partly because typology, unfortunately, is associated with such dubious subjects as palmistry, phrenology, and various somatic psychologies of this kind. Typology, as such, moreover, is very out of favour in the West, and perhaps the only respected psychologist advocating any kind of typology at the present time being H.J. Eysenck. Nonetheless, we proceed. From now on, actual diagrams can be dispensed with, and instead solely the alphabetical shorthand used. The models can be made slightly more sensitive and less narrowly typological by the application of some of the normal conventions of algebraic notation. Some lesbian tendencies presumably arise because the woman concerned has a larger than usual share of physiological or psychological male characteristics. Such a lesbian, nevertheless, retaining all or much of her femininity, a sort of cognitive woman, might have the profile capital A, capital B1, lowercase b2. A butch lesbian, on the other hand, endowed perhaps with male aggression rather than intellect, might show lowercase a, capital B1, capital B2, or in extreme cases, capital A, lowercase b1, capital B2. It will be noticed that the feminine lesbian has been given the same profile as the artist homosexual of figure 5. Indeed, one would not be looking for marked differences between these various types of individuals. The position can be somewhat retrieved by the resort to algebra. Thus, next, capital A over capital B1 times B2, or whatever that means. I don't even know how you read these bloody things. So capital A1 and capital A and capital B1 dominant over B2, submissive or whatever you call it. I don't know. Artist homosexual, and capital B1 over capital A, and then submissive B2 is an intelligent feminine lesbian. I mean, this is 1972. Remember, it's before lesbians became trendy. So, there are a lot of lesbians now who've just been forced into it through media and such. And for it being just trendy. The same as people used to wear flares because they were trendy. But now, not everyone wears flares. The implication is that the maleness of this homosexual and the artist in general is somewhat more dominant than in the case of the lesbian. A similar distinction can be drawn between the extremely masculine or butch lesbian and the average male. Where's that one? Have we got that? I think we have, but I think it might be off the page a little bit. Okay, hold on. No, I can't retrieve it. Sorry. It's basically capital B2 over capital A, and then lowercase b1 equals butch lesbian, and the opposite way around, capital A over capital B2 and lowercase b1 normal male. While there is no intention and perhaps in fact no possibility of refining the notation proposed beyond this level, the device is retained as a useful shorthand. It has the advantage that one can apply it not only to real people but also to mythological and hypothetical figures, and usefully even to situations, as will be seen. For the moment, however, we consider two additional figures only, God and the devil. The Christian God is strong on love, strong on anger, but weak on, i.e. anti-knowledge. That is, weak on knowledge 1. His profile is therefore capital B1, capital B2, lowercase a. The devil is strong on aggression, strong on knowledge 1 or 2, but a non-starter in love, although he enjoys ego-centered sex. The profile is therefore capital B1, capital A, capital B2, capital A, lowercase b1. Let me see if I've got these as no, that's not that slide. I think it's on this page, but I've got a feeling that I might have to open the page up a bit more. Hold on. See if I can do it. Let's see if it's actually there. No. Is there any way to write that up? No, it's not having it. Anyway, you'll just have to trust me. Symbolically now, rather than algebraically, these last are perhaps best expressed as follows. And then we've got God is capital B1, capital B2 over lowercase a. So he's a reverse pyramid sort of thing. And then the devil is capital B2, capital A over B1. Indicating that here the major features of the personality seek to destroy or at least dominate that in the personality which is a threat or anathema to the dominant personality organization. This offers us possible pointers again towards neurosis and psychosis respectively. Here too the feminine bias of God and the male bias of the devil, as discussed in chapter 1, are very much in evidence. These considerations have taken us a little aside from the normal male and normal female profiles of figure 3. Figure 3, there you go. To which attention should now be redirected. In this connection, it would seem appropriate at this point to make a more searching examination of men and women in general. The view of this book is... let me go back. I can leave that up. I suppose we've got more of these algebraic things coming up. No, we haven't. Okay, so I'll cut back to the main shot. There. The view of this book is unequivocally that if the choice had to be made, more profit would emerge from regarding women as a different species from man than from regarding both as members of the same species. This attitude is in no way shared by the experimental psychologist. Such data as actual experiment has produced nevertheless supports the view of the present book. There are in psychology 3 approaches open to the experimentally inclined. 1. Actual experimentation. 2. Failing this or prior to this, controlled observation. And 3. The gathering under rather less controlled and controllable conditions of very large amounts of information or data, which by their very size overcome the chance fluctuations that the usually small-scale experiments seek to eliminate by the controlled manipulation of variables. It is the third of these approaches which best suits the very broad orientation of the present inquiry, and it is here, in fact, that the most supportive evidence is found. As an initial step, nevertheless, the findings of small-scale controlled experiments are considered. It will be seen that these tell us little that we did not already know. It appears first that girls in general excel somewhat over boys in general in all forms of verbal fluency, but not in word definition. Second, that boys in general excel over girls in general in all mathematical operations involving reasoning and problem solving, but not in straightforward computation. It would rather seem then, putting these two findings together, that girls are stronger in the more concrete aspects of verbal and number ability, boys in the more abstract properties of these. This observation appears to be borne out by the fact that on tests of vocational aptitude, girls score significantly higher than boys on tests of clerical aptitude and dexterity, skilled movement. There is further a large and significant difference in favour of males on tests of spatial visualization. This links to the allied demonstration, for instance, that boys are significantly better at ignoring the visual field in which a pattern being studied is buried than are girls. Girls have therefore been described as field dependent. In her article on sex differences under the general entry Individual Differences in the International Encyclopedia of the Social Sciences, Leona Tyler reports in the context of a summary study by E. Bennett and L. Cohen some of the general conclusions of the literature, these being: A. Masculine thinking is oriented more in terms of the self, or as we'll say, ego, whereas female thinking is orientated more in terms of the environment. Masculine thinking is associated more with desire for personal achievement, feminine thinking more with desire for social love or friendship. And C, masculine thinking finds value more in malevolent and hostile actions against a competitive society, whereas feminine thinking finds value more in freedom from restraint. One notes here the tendency for ego to be associated with masculinity, which agrees well with the personality profiles of the previous section. The link between masculinity and aggression is also clear. This is just about all that experimental psychology has to report on general personality variations between the sexes except for large amounts of pure description as contrasted to explanation in highly technical language of differences even more self-evident than those offered above. A further word may be added, however, in respect of intelligence. The following extracts are taken from the article by Leona Tyler, already cited. One persistent question has stimulated research interest throughout all these periods. Why have women's achievements failed to match those of men? Why are there so few outstanding female artists, scientists, or statesmen? From many sources, evidence was accumulated that intelligence tests of all varieties do not and cannot measure pure native capacity. Although genetic differences in intellectual potential undoubtedly exist, the only way we have to test a person is to ask him questions or give him problems to solve. His performance in such a situation always reflects the experience he has undergone as well as his native capacity. It is, therefore, only natural that males show superiority in dealing with some kinds of questions and tasks, and that females show superiority in dealing with others. In order to produce intelligence tests that will be equally fair to members of both sexes, psychologists try to include approximately the same number of both kinds of item. When this kind of test is given to samples of the population, sex differences in overall score or IQ turn out to be negligible. There are two main points here. First, it seems agreed that native, that is inborn or inherited differences in level and in type of intelligence exist. Second, that the different upbringing of boys and girls tends to give them, respectively, a different kind of training. If the article is merely saying in the statement, in order to be equally fair to members of both sexes, that an attempt must be made to counteract or offset the influence of the differing opportunities for learning which boys and girls have even in early years of childhood, then well enough. To the present writer, however, it seems that what is implied here is that differences in types of ability dependent on sex should be compensated for in tests of ability. It is not then being suggested that boys and girls should not be tested or treated differently, even though they are different. Should one have tests which are fair to both? Should one not rather have tests which are fair to each? If one devised a joint test, say for both elephants and crocodiles, in whom genetic differences of ability undoubtedly exist, it would be necessary to leave out many items precisely at which the two creatures differentially excel. For the crocodile scores 0 on squirting water through his nose, and the elephant does badly swimming in measured course underwater. But what on earth would be the point of giving the two animals the same test? And let us not say, to achieve a fair comparison. There can never be such a thing between two differing organisms. Even then, an essential point is somehow missed. The point is that these girls are being tested on devices produced in a male-oriented Western society of the 20th century. One could say male-dominated. The expressed aim of which, meaning the tests, but as much the society which produced it, is the maximum standardization both of question and response. The psychotic overtones of this last statement will, incidentally, be re-examined in full. Let us consider some further aspects. On the basis purely of the evidence supplied by the experimental psychology, what would be one's prediction, for instance, of the relative proportion of men and women at present in psychiatric hospitals in this country? The only sensible reply to this question is to say that experimental psychology has provided us with nothing, so far, which would be of any real help in formulating an answer. Still, if one were earnestly required to make an estimate on the basis of the information that is provided, would one not be obliged to assume roughly equal proportions? After all, both boys and girls have some aptitude in their favour, and as far as intelligence goes, are allegedly more or less equal. These are the actual figures for patients occupying psychiatric beds in the British Isles in 1967. So we've got the numbers somewhere here. So for mental illness, we've got males 65,000, females 99,000, and then psychopathic disorder, males 2,600 and females 1,300. So we've got 2/3 of the amount of men in psychiatric beds for mental illness, and roughly double the amount of men for psychopathic disorder. The sharply reversed trends of the two categories show 35% fewer men than women in the first category and 50% more men than women in the second. Summating the two categories still produces an excess of women over men of some 34%. Is it allowable to deduce from this data that our society is more inimical to the female than the male organism? Or is this merely a differential response to stress, since the psychopathic category contains twice as many males, and prisons show a similar and still stronger bias in this direction? The statistics of the literature are in fact littered with instances urging explanations based on sex differences rather than any other variable or set of variables. For example, maximum admissions to hospitals of men suffering from schizophrenia are between the age of 20 to 24. For women, the high point of admission occurs between 35 to 39. As we noted in Chapter 1, the peak of sexual activity for men happens to be in the years 14 to 17. Oh, camera's gone off again. It's all right. I'm still here. The bookshelf's still here. I'm still here. Don't worry. I'm just going to get the camera back up and running. I've got to get this this setup needs to be just refined a little bit. This is my remote setup. Oh, there we are. There we go. For women, the high point of admission occurs between 35 to 39. As we noted in Chapter 1, the peak of sexual activity for men happens to be in the years 14 to 17. For women, the peak is reached around age 28. The coincidence is interesting. Of course, one should beware of simple explanations. After all, the early 20s for a man is also a time in which he is called upon to take his place in an adult, highly competitive society. For a woman, the late 30s are a time when her sexual attractiveness may diminish rapidly, but her chances of having children, if she has not already done so, are almost past, and the menopause looms ahead. This time would prove perhaps especially difficult for women who have not married. However, one's faith in a more sexual, that is, libidinal explanation is continually revived. We're going to touch on some Kinsey. Kinsey, for instance, notes that twice as many boys who reach adolescence early have homosexual experiences as boys reaching adolescence at the normal time and reaching it late, and that this difference persists until the age of 25. Kinsey suggests, as a factor in the development of the homosexual, age of onset of adolescence, which probably means the metabolic drive of the individual, may prove to be more significant than the much discussed Oedipus relations of Freudian philosophy. As far as this book is concerned, what is of most interest here is that early adolescence is actually characteristic of the female as opposed to the male, and that females are normally attracted to males. Yet, here again, one must perhaps be watchful for alternative explanations. The boy who reaches adolescence early is still a school child. He may, after all, be drawn to other males by a lack of other outlets at the time. It is when one sets out to examine the incidence of assorted phenomena in terms of sex differences that one discovers what amounts to, say, a conspiracy of silence. Whether intentional or not is hard to say. It is rare to find breakdowns by sex in tables even where they would seem to be relevant, e.g. in records of types of mental illness and social deviance. A rather surprising majority of the readily available reference works, both of a general and psychological nature, are at fault in this. In a 20-page article on suicide by 3 contributors, again in the International Encyclopedia of the Social Sciences, for example, sex differences are not even mentioned. In order not to leave this on a purely impressionistic basis, I examined current numbers of the 5 major psychological journals published in this country. The first considered was the British Journal of Psychology. In the 14 papers which this contained, no mention occurred of sex differences at any point. In the 17 papers which the next publication, the British Journal of Education Psychology, contained, sex differences were reported in one table of one paper. No discussion of these differences occurred in the text. In both of the journals named, mention was made in one or two papers that the sample considered was entirely male, but no instance occurred where an all-female population was studied. In the British Journal of Social and Clinical Psychology, 4 out of the 13 papers showed sex in tables and discussed differences between the sexes. A 5th paper stated that its sample, which happened to consist of Australian Aborigines, was composed of 50% males and 50% females, but no further mention of sex was made in the text. In the British Journal of Medical Psychology, however, all 18 papers dealt in one way or another with sex differences, and this in many cases was the central purpose of the paper in question. In proceeding from the first to the last of these journals, one had the feeling of returning from an area of non-sanity to one of sanity, despite the bizarre nature of the subject matter of the last mentioned journal, to a world in which men and women do different things for different reasons. So I think he's on the cusp of the sort of the time period where they start saying there's no real differences between men and women, because they're trying not to mention the differences between men and women, and by lumping everyone together you get these odd results where it's, you know, the experiences of women could be polar opposite to the experiences of men, but you get a sort of median point between them all, so then they start treating everybody the same anyway. In professional circles associated with psychology, it is often queried in semi-humorous vein whether the contributors to the psychological journals have ever seen a human being. In respect of the 5th journal, the British Journal of Mathematical and Statistical Psychology, one can only assume that it was intended for a readership on some other planet. It does not at any rate appear to be about people. Instead of men and women, psychology talks of subjects. The dictionary defines subject as someone who is under the domination of another. Speaking of the psychotic individual, Lang wrote, "The body is felt more as one object amongst other objects in the world than as the core of the individual's own being. Would it be unfair to say of the experimental psychologist, a man or woman is seen more as one object amongst other objects in the world than as the core of an individual's own being?" As stated earlier, large-scale surveys, preferably repeated over time, are an appropriate method of demonstrating permanent trends. The extension geographically and over time tends to ensure that the distorting effect of local or chance conditions are smoothed out. Of nature, too, it has been said in a general scientific context that she reveals all her secrets to us all the time. Certainly it is true that she conducts at every moment an infinity of experiments and presents us with the results of 1 billion surveys. Does it not show a lack in ourselves rather than any deviousness on the part of nature if we are unable to or refuse to make judicious use of the information given? The data which, say, Freud or Darwin gathered and presented had, after all, existed on open view since mankind began. The question now is whether there are other kinds of such evidence available which may be of use to us in the present inquiry. I suggest that at least some of the persistent behavioural differences between men and women on show throughout history and at the present time are not due to local conditions or to a lack or surfeit of opportunity in respect of either sex, but a reflection of permanent genetically based differential endowments. The topic is an inflammatory one. Quite aside from its emotional charge, however, the purely factual investigation of the interaction of environment, or opportunity, and potential, which is what is being discussed, is amongst the most complex issues facing modern psychology. We need, therefore, to phrase what is to be said very carefully indeed. It must first be understood that we are dealing in generalizations. A generalization does not merely admit of, but actually implies occasional exceptions. These do not necessarily of themselves destroy the generalization or render it invalid. With this provision, we may now consider one or two instances. The reader might like to take a little piece of paper and write on it the names of all the women composers of music, past and present, that he can think of. On a second or the same piece, he should then write down the names known to him of all the female writers of comedies or comedy material. This exercise should sufficiently illustrate the point that women do not write symphonies nor make jokes. At least they have not yet done so. The observations in question are of interest because there are large numbers of female singers, instrumentalists and accompanists, and many outstanding women writers. In other words, it is not easy to see how women could be said in any immediately obvious sense to have been debarred from the general provinces, music and literature, from which our examples are taken. The environmentalist position, however, in general argues a lack of opportunity in cases of such non-achievement. In the present instance, at least, it would seem insufficient to employ the undifferentiated blanket term environment. The environmentalist must be prepared to say much more precisely how it is that our society prevents women from writing music without preventing them from performing and interpreting it. One cannot hope to open up here in any adequate sense the complexities of the question of the differences in male and female achievements in terms of opportunities offered or withheld. One would be obliged, for instance, to attempt a definition of what constitutes a major contribution in a wide variety of fields, or more importantly, to define the difference, never in any case an absolute difference, between a truly innovative and a merely developmental or applied contribution. Two comments can nevertheless be made. The first is that when the achievements of women over the last few hundred years are examined, one finds these to be contributions to the arts rather than the sciences. As it happens, we shall later be arguing a strong System B component, more precisely a B1 component, in artistic creativity, so that an observation that women excel more readily in the arts is quite acceptable. The second point is a purely personal conclusion. That is, as a generalization, the difference between what does and does not lie within a woman's grasp is the difference between here is an existing situation, do something with it, and here is a vacuum, fill it with something entirely new. That, in other words, the question of the achievement potential of women and its precise nature devolves in the last analysis on the field dependency of women, noted earlier on their attachment to the existing, the actual and the concrete. So I think I'll put a tissue in the book at that point, and I'm going to just quickly have a look through the text. We've absolutely smashed through some of the book today. So we're about a third of the way through now. So let's go back to my main shot. There you go. So I have to go back a little way because I did miss a few. I was just going. The only way out is in. Glad it's not Freudian. That was for the last chapter. Yep. Yeah, it's not Freudian. Fremen on the Sand. Been busy past few weeks. Next few weeks, hoping to catch up on these works. Hopefully there's an RSS feed. Yeah, I was thinking of doing that actually. I'm going to have to start linking them together into actual chapters, and then I'll start putting them into a feed. Unironically, I think Frank Herbert was the most feminist author I know, as the Bene Gesserit are the best depiction of competent, strong women shown. Even from the get-go, they were keen to stress how they couldn't do man things. Frank Herbert's aunt and mother were both Jesuit, so make of that what you will. Girls are genetically predisposed to being in the average. 2 X chromosomes will do that. Males are predisposed to mutation with the XY pair, sometimes produces idiots, sometimes geniuses. Okay, so in this, I'm not going to get into all these other sort of theories, because what we're looking at in this book is like a completely new way of looking at things. So I don't want to sort of involve anyone else's work. So the idea that like mutations and things like that are a part of what causes idiots or geniuses, I think that Gooch is proposing a completely different model, or that's what he proposed back in 1972, was a different model of how genius or whatever comes about. So yeah, I mean these things are interesting, but I'm not going to really, I don't mean this in a bad way. I'm not going to entertain anything else while we're doing this this work, because this is really, I've got to keep focused on the work, and trying to explain other people's work within it sort of takes a long time away from the actual work itself. But we will get on to stuff about genius and all this sort of thing, and what even constitutes genius, and why something's a genius, and what sort of geniuses you need, and you know, some of these things are actually just quite subjective in terms of what is a genius. You know, you can have someone who's got a really massively high IQ, but they're an absolute fucking bellend. The only way out is in that archival reference data that says we're all the same is psychopathic as it is. The people who were investigating and recording it, yeah, he did. Gooch did end that section by agreeing with that. Is that the actual gathering of the data is just like literally psychopaths. And then Fremen on the sand. Yeah, you love tangents. Yes. Yeah, well, that's just, I mean, that's good. What I'm hoping to do is lay out something that can then be weaved as Henrik says on Red Ice, weaved back together into any thread, you know, woven back in to a larger picture. So this is just like a theory that's been completely missed out. So I'm going to try and like lay out as much of it as I can, and then hopefully some big brain nerd out there is going to take parts of it and melt it back in with other things. So yeah, that's good. All right, so it's 10 to 10. So time for you lot to go to bed. And then yeah, I've got still a few things to do before I can put my head down. So thanks for coming along every week and joining me reading through this. I hope everyone's enjoying it. There's obviously going to be some controversial stuff in there for some people, and bits that people haven't heard for a long time. It's from the early 70s, so you know. But the thing with Gooch is he's not like a hippie, and he's not a establishment type guy or an orthodox thinker. He is an original, you know, he's a source of originality. And there aren't many writers that I could say that about, where they're a source of originality. Anything that you can put to them, there seems to be an original take on it, rather than just something where they tell you, oh, so-and-so said this about this subject, you know, and you think, yeah, I know, I've read that somewhere else. So yeah, thanks everyone for coming along and joining in, and I'll see you all next Monday, when I'll be back in front of the old bookshelf for the rest of this chapter. Right, find my outro, and goodbye.